Welcome to the 2-Month Review, the weekly podcast brought to you by Open Letter and 3% and our Patreon supporters, in which we take one, or in this case, 2 books, break them down week by week, bit by bit, section by section, talk about them, analyze them, have a good time. I'm Chad Post from Open Letter Books, joined as always by Brian Wood, author of Joytime Killbox.
Hey, Hot Boy Summer, almost here.
Almost! I'm getting there, man. I'm going to get tan, get that Hot Boy Summer going. I think it's also supposed to be like Short King Summer, which is good for me. Which ties into our chapter for today when we can talk about runts and what a runt is, and whether that's an acceptable term to call another human being or not. But anyways.
Wait, Short King? What's this?
I saw this on the Twitter. I think it's for like short men that are like.
Hey, and we're joined by Katie Whitmore, translator extraordinaire. We've got to bring sanity and some intellect to this podcast.
You're gonna save us. Last week was rough,
guys.
So, like, do we have to brand each summer? Like, does it have to? Like, last year was Hot Girl Summer.
Well, last year I decided it was Hot MILF Summer, but that was maybe my own thing. So that was.
We already went over this. It's Yummy Mummy, by the way. We already
Yummy Mummy. That's what we went with. That's right. It was Yummy Mummy. You're right. You're right.
What was that from? Which book is that from?
Wasn't it from Vernon Subutex? Vernon Subutex. Yummy Mummy.
Yummy Mummy Summer. French translation.
I think that was one of the most insightful debates you guys have had.
Yeah, absolutely. That word addiction is so important, especially when you're talking about sexual attraction and the male gaze to women. Yeah.
I do have to say that in Latvia, which I'm no longer in, which is why this is all working, there are an insane amount of graffiti referring to MILFs. Like, there's an insane amount of MILFs. Like,
does it mean something else?
No fewer than 6 pictures on my phone of MILF-related graffiti, or there's a coffee shop that's like MILL or something, like Mill maybe, and it's like rewritten to be MILF on like half of the signs on the building. Like, it's incredible. Like, there is just no compunction. They just go for it. And I to be honest, I kind of respect it. I think
does it mean something else in Latvian? Like, is it a real it's just
nope.
MILFs.
It'd be wonderful if it meant something really earnest and powerful.
Yeah.
Like, I slayed a bear and fuck Russia. That's actually what it stands for. Now that I'm not there, I can make fun of Russians without danger, I think.
Does that have to look over your shoulder?
What country?
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty sure that they're the ones that hacked my computer and why it wasn't working for so long.
What country are you in now?
America. New Jersey. It's its own country. Newark.
America.
When are you back to Rochester?
Today.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we just came in and stayed overnight in the hotel for one night to like not have to drive 5 hours back from the airport right away.
Oh, cool.
But we get a rental convertible, so I'm gonna come Manchester in style.
I hope you brought your sweatshirts. I mean, Brian was all bundled up. 65 degrees Fahrenheit.
It was never warmer than 60 degrees in Riga the entire time. So anything right now, it just feels like, incredibly warm. Not Valencia.
A rental convertible.
I don't
know if is that prudent with a child? Is that good parenting? I'm not sure.
I'm pretty sure I'm just going to leave them at the side of the road and go cruising.
You're going to like a Rogaine commercial. Just driving a convertible, hair flapping everywhere.
my long pandemic hair, because I haven't gotten it cut since before we left.
Keeps for men. Keep what you have before you get smiling a convertible driving.
Yeah.
Guys, should we talk about the book or no?
That's how I'm going to do our Alpha meeting today.
We're passing the book.
Which book do you want to start with? We've got, so the 2 books we're covering this season are DML Eltit's Never Did the Fire and Danny Hahn's translation diary that accompanies it called Catching Fire. I would actually prefer to start with Danny's book.
I have a question for Katie about Danny's, one of the entries. I've been really interested as I'm becoming more professional in my writing. Like, word count is king. Like, you don't even care about pages anymore. It's all about the word count. And that's like your measuring stick for everything. And I thought it was really interesting talking about, he was talking about being paid by the word, and sometimes there's more words or less words. When you translate, are you trying to, like, because to me, like, the sign of like elegance and gracefulness and doing a good job is if you lower the word count. right? Like if you can distill things down, you're doing a better job. But sometimes, you have more adjectives or whatever. You can't say it the right. Do you keep track of what the original word count is and what your word count is when you translate? Like how far they are?
No, the only time that I do is when we're doing what Danny described, which is like, predicting what the word count's going to be for the contract, right?
Okay.
But it would be cool to compare. I mean, I think some of the writers that I've worked with, like Sarah Mesa or John Bilbao, whose novella I translated, The Strangers, it's coming out in the fall. They're spare writers.
Yeah.
And so that was easy, easy in that way to keep that sort of, concision in the English. Then there are other writers that I work with, like Aroa Moreno Duran or Lara Moreno, where it's like more expansive. It's very precise. But it's, like their choices are precise, but the language itself is not very contained. It's much looser and sort of, I guess more expansive in that way, the prose. And those ones, I think, I know I trimmed a lot there, because it just, in English, it gets too unwieldy. It doesn't work the same way. Like the effect is more distracting, I think, to try to retain sometimes so much of the verbosity.
Yeah, and none of those have the same sort of repetition that this book does, that Eltit does either. Like having read the ones that you're talking about, all of them, they are verbose, and they are like sort of like long in their metaphors at times. They're extended descriptions, but they're not like set up to be repetitive in that way.
No.
So like having them makes it really function in English. I wanted to bring up the same section, Brian. That's the same one that I wanted to start with, because I wanted to put forth the idea that like we shouldn't do things based on word counts anymore. I think that it's like artificial and strange. One reason that it came about was that it used to be translators be paid by page, because you didn't have word processors, so you just did 100 pages, you got paid for 100 pages. But once you could use Microsoft Word or Word Perfect or whatever to count the words, you could then do it by words, and that would eliminate all the blank spaces on the page. So if you translated pages of dialogue previously, you would have gotten paid more than you were, because there aren't that many words. Yeah. And I think that whole thing is like odd. And I think that a book shouldn't be based on the value of the books. The value of the translation should not be 100% tied to the length of the book.
So what are you proposing for the alternate system?
For example, if you did a budget on like what you thought this book could sell and what this book could earn in grants and everything else, and that it's a short book, but that the fair ratio wouldn't be $120 per 1,000 words, but closer to like, say, whatever, like $5,000, $6,000 to translate the book. To give it like a firm number like that feels to me more logical, because we don't do advances based on length of book. We do advances based on how many sales we predict there to be. And I know that translation sales don't ever match in terms of the amounts and the sales. Those two aren't going to be the same as they are for like an author, because the royalty rates are different or the fee rates are different or whatever. But nevertheless, I just like the idea of not treating everything as this sort of like reductive word count system. And even if it tends to be the same amount of money, even if it's like the same exact amount of money, there's something about it mentally to me that seems different. Like I don't like the idea of being paid by the hour either necessarily. Yeah. Like I like the idea of like
that's because you're a white collar bougie.
I believe the word is aristo is what she's called. Aristo. I'm an aristo.
Yeah.
I also buy clothes sometimes. I don't know what I'm doing. Like out of control with this aristo bougie lifestyle that I'm living in my convertible with my floppy hair.
Yeah, with your floppy hair, you fop.
Your Rogaine commercial.
Well, I think that sounds great. I mean, so obviously that would be good for translators if we were just sort of like looking at the overall word count and then bumping up a couple hundred. Is that kind of like how it would work?
Pretty much. The way that it would not work as well is on books that are extraordinarily long, because
Yes.
those always kill you to begin with. Like there are books that like, I mean, we have a 1,500 page novel coming out that's translated. That based on the per word count is like, there's no chance to make that money back. It's just not even remotely possible. Like you have to have a secondary income or a secondary process. That book will not make money.
Yeah.
Well, there's no reason for a book to ever be more than 200 pages. So
There's no reason. There's no reason for a book.
Exist, you know. So yeah.
Fair.
Mic
Use
drop.
your page limit. Cut it off. I don't know. That's not. I don't agree with that. But if everything had to be short, I would never be able to write a post, a text, a letter, and anything. I'm well known for not keeping things concise.
Clearly, I'm
You
joking.
would never be able to recount your dreams
I would never be able to recount my dreams.
moment by moment.
Well, shouldn't it be? You'd think that it would be like you get paid off of the word count of the original, not the word count of what you translated.
That's
Well,
what actually the way that
No, go ahead.
the way that we do it is it try to map those two, but yeah, you do it on the English one, not the original.
Really? Okay.
And usually there's like shrinkage
Mm-hmm.
from Spanish to English.
That's
And
what
I don't
she said.
know. And
No, that's what he said.
Yeah, there's always the shrinkage. So what about
I
what
have
are
a
some
convertible.
what are some languages where things get longer from?
I think that there are ones. I think like Asian languages tend to get longer because there aren't a lot of prepositions that are in there, and that isn't the same setup. So you do expand in that way. And I don't know about like Arabic, but I don't know. I think Arabic gets shorter actually because there's a lot of repetition in Arabic as well. Like you can never not say like a person's name. It's like the person with their kind of like moniker along with it. Like everything is repeated a lot. So I think that those tend to be a little bit shorter, but I believe Asian languages expand. And I feel like there's another one, like maybe Turkish or something else I've heard like is one that generally tends to be longer in English than in the original. But most of the Romance languages tend to shrink a bit because of all those prepositions, which is what we were going to talk about a couple of weeks ago with the stuff. Like how many times the shows up in Spanish and you don't need it in English all those times.
You don't. No.
Same thing. Us. It's as that.
A lot of that's, a lot of connectors. So one of the things I thought was kind of cool, and I had an experience recently where I wanted to be able to do this, which was when Danny talks on 125 when he's describing like, certain ambiguities or trouble he's having with the text and how like, one of the resources could potentially be the Brazilian translation of the book so that, he could, as he, reads Portuguese, he would be able to take a look at what Julianne Fuchs had done and be able to sort of gauge his reading of the Spanish against someone else's reading of the Spanish and that person's interpretation into Portuguese. And I had an interesting experience recently where I was reading a sample into English from French, and I don't read French. And I found myself wanting to like look at the original, and I kept thinking like, oh, I wish this was just, I would love to look at this translated into Spanish and how the Spanish translator would have dealt with this from the French. And so I think that's really, I don't know, I just really liked seeing that as sort of as an editing tool, just looking at various approximations and sort of like, checking your comprehension or your interpretation against someone else's. And what Danny says is like, he's not necessarily inclined or disinclined to go with the other interpretation, but that it does exist there for moments of ambiguity. Like you could see what someone else picked up on. I thought that was really interesting. And it made me want to learn more languages, just to be able to just check everybody's translations, check them all.
Well, what's interesting about that is like this ties into a grander theory I have. I'm gonna try and use that as a segue. How to say this? So I think that that's interesting. I also am very curious, having done so much research on data on what gets translated into English in particular, both somewhat in the UK, but primarily in the US market through the translation database and whatnot. I am curious as to how many books of this nature get translated in other languages.
He's in New Jersey, he said.
Yes.
They got the 2G in New Jersey. You got to go across the river if you want the 5G.
I can't even get, it keeps popping up. So if that cut in and out, I apologize. I could tell that it's not working. But so the thing that I'm curious about is how many of the books of nature are translated into that many languages, or because most of what we see when in terms of the publishing side of things is that when other countries are translating books from English or from other languages into their countries, they tend to be the more popular, more mainstream, more banal, less experimental books. This is intentionally provocative and like truly non-researched. So I kind of want you both to react, and anyone who's listening to get kind of pissed about this.
Really?
Like when you look at like books in Germany that are translated into German, and Germans are like, oh, we translate so much, we're amazing, we translate the world, blah, blah, blah. And you look at it and you're like, yeah, you translate fucking Paul Auster and like Jonathan Safran Foer. Like it's not really translating the obscure. And this came about, to back this up one step and to tie it into this, is it came about in a conversation I was having with this guy that runs a Latvian podcast who might come on here in the future. And he was talking, I was trying to get him, it took a lot of teeth pulling, but to get him to describe to me Latvian books that were outside of the traditional form and we're doing something more unique and more interesting. And he came up with one in particular, two actually, but one that was like, quote unquote, the Latvian Finnegan's Wake. He's like, but nobody reads that in Latvian. And I was like, that's fine, because once a book gets translated into English, because of our background in doing more, a lot of the translations that are done, a lot of the international literature that's translated into English is done by small, innovative, strange presses. And thanks to places like Delkey or Grey Wolf or Coffee House, but especially Delkey, there is like a grander tradition, a 40, 50-year tradition of finding like the strange, the unusual, the new, and the innovative in that sense. And I think that we have then created in English a better like landing spot for books such as this. But this is going to be a double-edged sword. For books such as this, it has a network. So this book in Latvia, there's no other book like it. There's nothing that can be compared to. You don't read something and then come across this book. It's such an outlier. But if you put that into the American context or English language translation context, there are 14, 15 different books. Thomas Johnson's bestseller, which we've done on here. There's like so many books that fit into, that could build off of that and create a more wide network of how to look at books across like in a rhizomatic fashion rather than in the sort of nationalistic fashion, which we're sort of trapped by frequently when people talk about literature and translation. And so my question is, like, we talk about French in particular, and Germany as being these bastions of translation, but I'm really curious as to how many like truly interesting, strange works actually get translated, and how much of it is just like American garbage that they translate and produce. And it's not always noble. It's just a book that sells. The second part to that is the double-edged sword to it is that this book can have a bigger readership in English than in Spanish and Chilean Spanish in some sense, because we have a network of people familiar with this sort of writing. But because we have a network of readers that are familiar with this sort of writing, it might not be up to par. It's not as likely to be as up to par because we have so many examples that we can rely upon or reference.
Or not even not up to par, but that it might not be as like groundbreaking as it might be when it appears in 2007 in Chile. I don't know, and I'm not sure. I think that's an interesting theory, and I haven't thought deeply enough about it to pronounce my opinions. But I do think that there's something to the fact that, and also it's interesting because, you know, this is being translated X number of years later. So between 2007 when it's written and 2022 when we're reading it, you know, you do the math, guys, but there's some years in there that that you know, where we might, you know, it might not be as groundbreaking in terms of style, which I think is really what this book is trying to do, in my opinion, because I think the thing that it's tackling, is you know, like a collective mourning. I think it's very much related to trauma, to both personal and societal trauma, especially coming out of like a, you know, a political and distinctly Latin American context. And so, but the way that she's doing it with this type of repetition and these sort of like these time slips and sort of the slow drip of information. And as Danny notes, you know, she's in the Spanish, you know, she's used, so this is something, sorry, I'm going to just slightly veer off, but I think something else that we're reading a book like this in translation is that, as Danny says, you know, Diamela uses words in Spanish in a sometimes incongruous or surprising way, right? But when you're reading the original book in Spanish, you know that this is an intentional act on the part of the author, right? To sort of make the text strange in this way, or be surprising, or sort of jolt us, or create new, you know, connections and webs of resonance, right? Or connotation. And when you're reading a translation, no matter how good the translator is, sometimes you think like, is that really what they meant to choose? Like, wasn't there a better word for that? You know, because you don't, it's like, you have to make these choices. And so if you have to go with the sort of stranger or less common choice of a word in English, in the translation, you know, sometimes it's like, you know, is this how we really should have translated it? Or, I don't know, but in the original, like you have this knowledge that what you're reading was really intentional, and we always have this sort of, we don't always have it, but I think there is some sort of suspicion with translation sometimes, is that it's like, did they really mean that?
Yeah.
You know, is that what they really meant to pick? Which puts us at a disadvantage as translators when you're doing something that is non-traditional in that way. Brian, what do you think?
I want to agree with you real quick, Katie, in that there is generally a tendency to overly criticize the sort of strangeness of language in a translation as if it is a translator's falling. But an example of that in here that would be maybe more interesting in the Spanish than it is in English is the one that I referenced as we were warming up. That was chapped cement, which is on page 92. They're murdered on the public street or in one of the emergency rooms, altogether dead, bloody, and visceral, with legs broken and guts dangling, strung up on the most well-guarded street, and one of your eyes flying towards the sidewalk, an anxious eye on the chapped cement, dead. Like that stands out very strangely in English, and it maybe was more something in Spanish than it is here. But Brian, your turn to take on this.
Oh no, I think with me, and I'm glad that Katie veered in this direction, was just the idea of ambiguity and like how purposeful it is in this book, and then the difficulty of translating the ambiguity. Danny mentions like how thankful he was that the word cells matches, you know, cellular structure, and obviously you could go into the weeds with when you talk about body politic and you know, completely through the entire work. But how many other instances are we missing that second layer because it doesn't translate? So I think it's really interesting. This just to me seems like a tremendously challenging translation with how purposefully layered every single and the weight that the word choices have for the theme that she's threaded through the entire piece.
Yeah.
Related to that, I have not entirely related to that, but I have a question for you, Katie, too. If we look at like page 111, he talks about finishing his first draft, and this is a process.
Oh wait, sorry, with Danny?
Yeah, sorry, with Danny's. Talks about finishing his first draft and what he does to go back through. And I know you have started to try and do more of leaving certain words in there like he does, and leave them in Spanish, or like not address them initially. And he goes through sort of the categories, like Spanish words he just doesn't know at all, words he thinks he knows, but he's not sure, English words he's not sure if they're used that way. And I just wondered about if you could reflect for a second on your process with that when you go back through. And I'll tip one part of this is that you seem to have a photographic memory for what the original is, which really alters the editorial process when you go through it, of like knowing exactly what it was said and then kind of playing with that. But I'm curious about what you see in terms of like the literal, like the words, like how many things do you end up having to try and research or look up or aren't sure about, and how that plays off of like what you know that you can and can't say in English, or how you can use words in English.
So my process has not been like Danny's process. Like I don't, I would do, the first draft, I would try to do it fairly quickly, but I would stop. I would take more, pauses to look things up that I didn't know in the moment. And then with the book I'm working on right now, I've been trying to do like this fast, loose translation and just leave behind what I don't know and leave it in the original and put things in bold and like try a little bit what Danny's done here. And I don't know that it's going to work for me that well. So what has worked for me in the past is doing like a pretty fast draft without trying to get things perfect. And without trying to worry too much about exactly how it will ultimately read in English, but try to get all the meaning down in the Spanish. And that for me, it does involve like stopping. Like I will take longer on my first draft because I typically don't have to look things up almost ever when I go through the second draft. So when Danny's talking about getting to the stage where he does all of his looking up and all sort of the research, and then he does that initial read through where he makes his choices and chooses things, I would tend to do that in a slower first draft, so that then when I'm doing that first major read through, I'm already beginning to tweak and I'm not going back to add things in. So it's interesting just to see what works for people. But I'm finding it like hard to skip over things that I don't know. I would tend to stop in the moment and try to hash things out first, at least on like a surface level, and then be able to go back to them and really, shift things around when I'm reading it in the English version. I mean, what I like to do is do the first draft and then put the original away, like completely. Yeah. Like I don't unless I really have a sticky area that I have to go over several times. When I do that first read through, I don't even look at the original at all. Like I just read it for what it looks like in English, what it's doing in English. And that's because I've stopped along the way. It's taken me longer to get there in that first draft because I've already sort of cleared up any doubts I had slowly as I go through the first draft.
That makes sense to me. Yeah. As a process. I forget who it was, but someone else not that long ago said something like that too, about they never use like X/Y, like when you have two choices, they're like, no, I make a decision every single time. Like,
I mean, I'll leave slashes, but I would usually not leave anything in Spanish. I would usually stop and sort of labor over figuring that thing out.
I think one of the best techniques that he has in here is deleting the pages from the PDF.
Yes.
Like I want to do that with this book I'm editing. If I deleted all the pages I've already edited, I would look like I'm so close to the end instead of like having literally 271 pages left to go.
I think, it's like all the little tricks,
There's no going back. It's like burning your ships when you land on the beach.
Burn the ships!
Nowhere but forward.
Nowhere but forward. Only victory. Yeah. That used to be the battle cry for Chloe when she did gymnastics.
Only victory?
No, burn the ships. It's a famous speech. It's a famous speech. So of like urging your clan. You get to the beach, you don't look back. Also ties into fire for this whole season.
One thing I did want to say that was interesting, just to close this discussion on the process-oriented piece, but the idea that like sometimes you don't know. One thing that Danny does, or that he describes, that I think is helpful, is for sure, is that you know, if you do things the way that I do them, you run the risk of like making too many decisions early on that later on you find in terms of like repetitions or, you know, of certain words or things to do with like tone or, you know, register, like being too firmly wedded to choices in the beginning, I think can kind of like trip you up as you learn more about the book and about the characters and about the voice as you go on. And so, you know, if you're like me and you want to make a lot of choices up front, you have to be really flexible later to go make sure you're going back. If you decide that like later on in the book, you're using another term or you're using a different register for something that you already had decided in the beginning was going to be a certain way, you're going to have to go back and rework those early pages.
That's funny because on the creative side of things, a lot of times I won't know what I'm writing about until it's actually finished. And then draft 3 or 4, you can start doing the diction choice that has the theme or the conceit that you put all the way through it.
Right.
If it gets translated, that could completely be lost if they don't pick up on it. Or
you have to pick up on it, and you might get to the end and say, "Wow." However, you know, and also if you're working with some of these larger books, by the time you get to, you know, your last pages, you know, it might have been like 6 months from when you started it, depending on if you're working on like several projects at once. And so that continuity, you know, I think you just have to be really flexible, which is creative in its own way too, and more fun, you know, to discover those things. And I'd rather discover that, you know, I was sort of reading something or that I wasn't seeing the whole picture. I would rather have to go back and do a lot of work at the beginning than to never notice that I haven't gotten the whole picture, because I think sometimes we can see that too, where you're like, I don't know if if you're really getting what's happening here. So
right.
Yeah, and I do feel from the journal, from Danny's journal, he does. I get the sense that he's like wrestling with the beast in some ways. It's like, this is freaking hard.
Yeah. I have to tie a bow on that too. I saw this, I think yesterday, but there's someone on Twitter named Claudine Borg. Well, they're not just Twitter; they're a human being as well. They exist outside of Twitter. But Claudine Borg has a book coming out from Routledge called "A Literary Translation in the Making: a Process-Oriented Perspective." That's coming out this fall, which could be interesting for people listening that are into the process side of literary translation. I don't know anything more about it. That's all. And then below it is some joke account, apparently, that I took a screenshot of called Cops of Monroe County. That's just making fun of the cops in Rochester. So that's Twitter in a nutshell. Literary translation process, making fun of shitty Rochester cops.
Well, that sounds really cool, the translation book.
Doesn't it? There's a whole, it's part of the Routledge series in literary translation, which I don't know what other books exist within that, but I'm curious now to check it out.
To take back to with word choices, I thought Katie would love that we get a lot of the kid in this in these chapters. You've been all over the kid this whole book.
All over the kid.
Who, me?
Yes, and that the kid died by fire, a fever.
Yes.
So
yes. Oh, I thought you were referring to the section about the use of the word kid versus doll versus wrist.
Oh, there's another one.
Oh, that too.
So when you were like, I've been all over the kid, I thought you were referring to that.
No. Yeah, that one.
Yeah, the baby. I have been all over the baby this whole time.
The baby, sorry, yeah.
Yes.
But again, that's one of those ones lost in translation. I thought the doll, the wrist, and the child, that doesn't work. I totally missed that until I read the journal.
Although, yeah.
Well, you wouldn't. It doesn't, because he couldn't do an equivalence. And I think it's interesting. I do have some thoughts on this. I don't have a better solution than Danny came up with, but I do have thoughts. But and it's just a brief thought. So maybe I'll express this first, and then I do want to talk about the baby and about catching fire. So there's a line in the book about catching fire, which I'm assuming is sort of where Danny's title came from for his diary. But yeah, the thing with so Danny mentions, in Spanish, the one word muñeca can mean wrist, and it can also mean doll, like a baby doll. And he didn't want to go with doll, right? Because we wouldn't get that sort of play with between wrist and doll, for example. But I think I really felt like calling someone a doll, like he didn't want it to sound like he was, you know, like a gangster movie or something, you know. But I feel like kid is too neutral. I feel like doll is so much more gendered. And I think that is important in this particular case because, you know, and she's a woman and she's, you know, she's taking all this, making all this effort to talk about, to talk about her credentials, right? And to say like, I was this unofficial lieutenant. I was like the best at strategy, the best at analysis. I knew, you know, the language background, this and that. And then she's sort of dismissed, right, as kid or as doll. But I feel like kid is too neutral because I read into this situation and I read into the word muñeca, calling someone a muñeca in Spanish would be more gendered. It would be specifically related to being female in this particular, we're seeing more of her as a female. Like the fact that they have tried to strip everything away and make themselves as like austere and as neutral as possible with what they eat and what they do, the shapeless clothes. And then we see two things happening, right? Like she has this experience with like wanting something, wanting a material good. She wants the dress.
Yeah.
And the dress has to come with like inappropriate shoes, which was so funny. And, you know, something like entirely unsuitable shoes.
Yeah.
And, you know, a crimson vermilion red mouth. And then we have the sight of her, you know, catching sight of herself in that storefront or in the mirror, and that she has the pregnant belly. And so, and it's like the fact that she gets pregnant and is going to have the child seems to indicate that this is like truly the beginning of the end for them as a couple and as a cell. And I thought that was really interesting. I want to read that part if I can find it because.
Is it on 101?
What's that?
Is it 101?
It might be. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So she's saying like, okay, this was, so I didn't get this at first. All right. On 100, in the middle of 100, she's talking about how she went out in a totally foolish act, breaking with any logic of safety. I went out, walked along the pavements, exposing my already openly deformed appearance.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, what? I underlined that with a question mark, thinking like, how is she deformed?
Right.
She's deformed because she's pregnant. Like she has this belly. And she says, you know, where is that? It was so, I really liked it. This thing about the belly. Oh yeah. Okay. Sorry. So now we jump forward to 105.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. And she said, and well, on 104, she starts to say that, you know, a frantic search through the shop windows, through black pointed shoes, quite unsuitable footwear, shoes verging on the scandalous, with my two red lips and the dress, until the whole scale of the crisis appeared in the mirror that kept on reflecting a crazy, ferocious image. The belly, an image of me that terrorized us. Do you remember? And I think that's really intense. And I think that this relationship of the narrator to her body and to her womanhood, motherhood, her like the state of her as a physical, corporeal being is for me one of the most interesting facets of certainly this section. And you know, Brian, in one of the first episodes, you know, you were talking about them wasting away and like how there's so much decay present, a physical decay that we're seeing, you know, with like the teeth and the bodies wasting away and everything hurts them, you know, their bodies are sore, their limbs are falling asleep. And then you have this moment of that's associated with their downfall and with complete, you know, like crisis and collapse, which is her getting pregnant, putting the cell at risk in that way, herself and the relationship at risk. And then later, you know, like the death of that child, which is the big trauma. It's the thing that is, for me anyway, so far driving the whole narration as the central sort of unspeakable, unrepresentable fully. And like, you know, she can't quite integrate this into her life, into herself. And it's what is producing this sort of like traumatic repetition.
Even the way that this this chapter started with, she doesn't call it a nightmare, but a very disturbing dream, and waking yourself to try to want to understand it or to work it out. And so I got the sense that writing was going to be the way to do that, but then the hand won't work. Like,
Right.
your body is failing you yet again, and there's no understanding, there's no working it out. It's just that constant that you're stuck. Like, it's
that there is actually this is if I were super high, this would maybe make more sense as like a thread. But there is also something about that birth giving and the fact that she's the secretary, which is actually like there. I think it's a Stalin quote, but or maybe it's Lenin, but one of them was like, the secretary is the most important because they get to write history. And part of the running thread throughout this that Danny also alludes to is that a lot of the quotes are from the Communist Manifesto, but they're wrong. And she's creating something that's off that also brings about the downfall of the cell in the same way that she's engendering the one mistake, the one misphrasing, but creates a different meaning out of what was there. And that seems to me like to parallel the pregnancy and the downfall, the death of the baby, but also the death of the cell.
Yeah. So this is interesting. So on 95, toward the end of that first long paragraph, you're talking about the boy and the fever and, the noise and the sound of his lungs, et cetera, et cetera. And again, we have this image of like, leaving someone, she's saying, I wish I had taken the boy and left you to die like a dog in the room. And again, it's like, you were a dog, which is an interesting repeating image. But she says, we would survive. We'd get away from the hell of your face and away from the hell that you thought without respite, that the boy was a product of the horror, of the madness, that the boy was a flaw, my pig-headedness, a malicious understanding of history that brought our militant duty tumbling to the ground. And so for me, this is like there seems to be something in her that is more, excessive and sort of unwilling to be as contained as she should be, right? To sort of have successfully navigated all these things that they're trying to navigate in being militants. And the idea that it's like, it's her flaw, it's her stubbornness, that leads not only to, like you say, like to having a child, the child then dies and it's the end of the cell. And, I'm sure we're going to find out more exactly what happened. But that child is certainly, I think, the crux of it. So yeah, the line is
96.
96, yeah. Onto a boy who was catching fire with fever.
And that sort of duplicates on page 100, 101, or like then is echoed on 100, 101 in a way that also echoes the Illuminata book, that the earlier book of hers we talked about in the early seasons, where this is a long quote, but it's probably my favorite quote. I struggle to take off the bulging trousers, the shapeless blouse, the best, to burn them, destroy them in the devastating power of a bonfire, and go blindly or virginally toward the dress to be reborn or revived, or to avoid a destiny marked by the total excess of body, by the absence of outlines, a body that had experienced naked or real history, a history that through its whole vast time always went out of its way to destroy.
Yeah, I love that too.
And in her dream, the child was exposed. It was without clothes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I think too, I know Danny had mentioned the word history in Spanish could also mean story. And the idea that she is the secretary and maybe getting it wrong. And it makes me think of that quote of like, those that don't know history are doomed to repeat it. But like, what if your history is written down wrong? You'll still repeat, the mistakes are still going to be repeated. Like it's a trap. There's no way out of it. And you see this happening in this book as well, which I think is kind of cool.
You're 100% teeing up my favorite conspiracy theory of the moment. Like in every possible way. Can I please have a minor digression just for entertainment's sake?
Yes. Well, did you guys plan this ahead of time?
No.
Okay.
No, I've just had it in waiting because I'm obsessed with it. I read the book. I finished this book, Anthem by Noah Hawley, that includes like a lot of stuff from the present moment, set a couple years in the future. It talks about the insurrection, which obviously is a big deal right now as Congress is giving us a 6-part Netflix documentary on how the January 6th happened.
Well, according to the coach of the Washington Commanders, it was a little dust up.
It was a little dust up. No big deal.
A bunch of people committed suicide over, and people died over dust up. Just a little dust up.
Tucker Carlson doesn't have ads on his show anymore, so that people won't turn into any other station. This is insane that what we're living through. Anyways, there's a conspiracy. So he references a conspiracy theory in there that was not about this. And to find out what it was, I ended up on this amazing thread in which there are two things. This is how like conspiracies work and how I think like could tie into like a revolutionary idea work, where you have two things that are totally true, and the only way you can tie them together is through a leap of insanity. So when Nikola Tesla died, because he was an immigrant, his papers were seized because he had, caused using like sound waves and repeating sound waves caused like a earthquake in Manhattan. He was like theoretically trying to create a death ray that would destroy things from afar. He had his idea of like having electricity through the atmosphere so we didn't have to have plugs. Like Tesla was like creating stuff that was like quote unquote dangerous or like on the fringes.
Mm-hmm.
Trump's great uncle was the one who was assigned to seize his papers and to review his papers for anything that was valuable for the US government. He claims almost immediately there's nothing valuable. However, to this day, those papers do not exist. They've never been released. They're hidden. They don't exist. This is fact, okay? Second fact, there is a guy named Ingersoll Lockwood who was born in New York and wrote 2 big novels that were about a character named Baron Trump. The first one is about Baron Trump coming up in Russia and in Germany and being like a really rabble-rousing, crazy kid that didn't pay attention to stuff, and gets in trouble all the time and is like, outside of the norm. And then the second one is called The Last President, which is about Baron Trump as a populist living on Fifth Avenue and Castle Trump winning an election as a populist and bringing about the downfall of America through these reactions. These 2 things are true. Both of these things are true. Now,
Ingersoll Lockwood this is real. There's really a book.
This is real. 100% real.
Time travel is the only way we can make this sense. That's the only connection is time travel.
So the only way to make it make sense is that Nikola Tesla invented time travel. And this is the way that in those papers, there's a time machine that allowed this to all go back and get written and allows then for Trump to become president somehow. Some of that logic's a little flaky, but I love that you can take these 2 things that are absolutely right and just link them through the most insane batshit idea.
Well, Tesla is the worst if he couldn't beat Edison with the invention of time travel. You suck, Tesla. You deserve.
Yeah. I mean, Tesla's a
terrible time traveler. We still have, Edison light bulb and plugs everywhere.
Although the Tunguska event is the death ray, I believe. When the Siberia big hole appeared out of nowhere and nobody knows why to this day, that was the death ray. Tesla did do that.
Yeah.
For sure. There's no question about it.
He's probably with Hitler on the moon somewhere trying to do the New World Order thing.
He actually invented Stanley Kubrick.
All right. Well, aside from that quote, do you have any favorite quotes from the book we read?
I do, but I also want to just bring up one point. I know as we're ending, but I want to see if this theme continues, and maybe we could talk about it next week, which is, this sudden, like, maybe it's not that sudden. I've got to go back and look, but it seems like there was a lot of talk of bones in this section. A lot of bones.
Avalanche. I love that.
Avalanche of bones.
A lot of bones. And I'm wondering, like, how we might look at that and compared with this other notion, Brian, of decay. So it's like flesh and bone. Certain things are falling away, and like what's left is like this skeletal image, and it's like, so I don't know. I think that I want to think about that a little bit.
Yeah, the exact line is bone avalanches in an evident state of war.
Yeah, it's creepy.
Yeah.
My other one is a big question about the same little runt whose face would later pop out of the photograph in the paper. I just want to point out that I take offense to that, and I feel violated. I feel like this is
Short King Summer.
Can we call people runts?
All right.
I don't know.
Of course you can. Yeah, you just get in trouble for it. But you can call anybody anything you want. You just can't, the consequence, who knows? So my favorite line was on 95. I have a slight preamble with it.
Okay.
I was driving my daughter to work. She's 7. And I don't know why, but she was saying, hey, if...
You were driving her to work?
Yeah,
Where does she work? Like
sorry. I was driving her
into it in the mills?
we live in Shenzhen, China. She makes Apple products.
Is she like...
She's got really nimble fingers.
She like spinning?
I was driving her to school. Sorry. School is her work.
Kind of a run, so it works.
I was driving her to the 1st grade. And she was mentioning in the car, hey, if you and mom split up, I'm gonna go with mom, okay? And I was like, what? First of all, we're not splitting up as far as I know. But secondly, I just love the fact that she's already decided the custody battle is solved. I'm going to stay with mom. It's like, okay. So with that in mind, here's my favorite quote on 95. You've got to die. And then I could go with the boy. Both disappear, the boy and me. And we leave you dead in the room like a dog. That's exactly what's going to happen to me.
Going with her mom.
I'm going with mom. Why? Because on the weekends she takes me out to breakfast. That was the reason. I asked her why. Like, not a failure.
All you do is bring her to work.
I know.
Just making her work.
I just
drop
take
her
her
off
there.
at the office.
You're a slave. Like you're a
At the
slave.
mill. Just to sit.
If you want to visit your child, buy them pancakes. You're probably gonna win that. You'll probably win that one.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I've lost custody of my daughter. Brutal.
Well, that was a really good line. Mine's not as exciting as yours, but I think it's funny. I like this little description that she gives of. I think this is like where we see some more of her personality. On 97, when she starts to give the description of when they're singing the International, and she's like, there they were, the historic leaders. I could see them lined up along a not especially evocative stage. I think that's great.
Like that's great.
Yeah, pretty dull. But that's what they call, and that's when they call her, bougie, because she cares about the setting. She thinks that there should be, more pomp, and she's an arista.
Aristo. Yeah, Aristo is pretty fun. Which, yeah, I'm not going to go off on that tangent. So next week, we go up to page 136 in Never Did the Fire, and in Catching Fire up to page 154, which is up to the entry for, 152. No. Yeah, 152, which is up to the entry for April 19th. For anyone listening. And since Katie wasn't here last week and we put this forth, next week you have to pick apart one of Brian's stories.
Oh, yeah.
And ridicule it. So go for it. Let me know which one you're going for, and we'll have some fun with that. And also, if you like what you hear, go sponsor us on Patreon, rate us, review us, give us comments. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Katie, for coming back. Thank you, Brian. Anyone
Thanks,
have a
guys.
final comment?
Good week. Have a nice weekend. Chad, enjoy your
I'm gonna get my convertible on now, guys. I'm gonna go midlife crisis my way back to Rochester. So peace.
Make sure you wear a nice little, you need